Listen carefully. The secret you are about to hear was never meant to escape the soil. It was meant to stay buried, deep beneath rotted timbers and damp earth where screams dissolve into silence. For 160 years, the ground has swallowed its truth, yet it still whispers through the cane fields of Franklin Parish, Louisiana. Not all graves are dug by priests. Some are dug by calloused hands under moonlight, sealed not with prayers, but with spit, ash, and symbols carved in blood. And when the dead are buried this way, they do not sleep. They scratch, they wait, they hunger. In the spring of 1853, a man named Josiah Brant walked those fields. Overseer by title, sadist by choice. He did not wield the whip for discipline, but for pleasure. He designed suffering like an artisan designs glass, shaping pain into spectacle. His whip was no ordinary leather. Its braided tip was threaded with copper wire. When it struck flesh, it sang. They say he named it, though no record survives of what name he chose. Men whispered he soaked it in brine between lashings, so the wounds would burn long after the blood dried. But cruelty has a way of bending reality around it, distorting not just bodies, but the air itself. Animals began to fear him. Dogs whimpered when he passed. Birds abandoned nests at his approach. He was not merely hated, he was set apart, marked, as though some darker force had chosen him as its vessel. And in time, the enslaved men and women of Westcott Plantation stopped praying for freedom and began whispering for something else. Not release, not mercy. Balance. Balance never comes gently. It comes like storm clouds at harvest, like rust spreading over steel. It was not the courts that would deliver justice to Josiah Brant. It was the earth. The same earth he stained with blood. The same earth where he forced men to dig their own shallow pits for a muse. Meant. On that land, beneath the quarters, a decision was made in silence. 12 souls bound by torment chose not to beg, but to bind. And what they bound has never truly slept. Do you feel it already? That pressure behind your ribs? That faint unease crawling under your skin? That is not me. That is the echo of a scream muffled by soil. The land remembers. Soil is not silent. It keeps record in ways men cannot erase. In 1853, under the decaying rafters of the slave quarters, the earth was already restless, already listening, and the 12 who suffered most beneath Josiah Brant's hand began to notice its hunger. They did not speak of rebellion in the open. They spoke in the glances of weary eyes, in the rhythm of work songs that carried double meanings, in the carved spirals hidden beneath floorboards where white eyes would never look. Among them was a man known only as Elijah. He had arrived that winter, tall, calm, with scars unlike the others, rings burned into his flesh, deliberate, ceremonial. No one knew from where he came, but when Brant struck him in the field before dozens of witnesses, Elijah did not bow his head. He looked directly into the overseer's eyes and whispered words that cut deeper than any lash. The earth takes back what's been stolen. From that night forward, a rhythm passed through the quarters, a rhythm not of chains, but of preparation. The 12 began to meet without meeting, gathering without words, aligning without sound. One was a cook, one a boy barely grown, one a man broken in body, but not in will. Each carved marks into stone, into bark, into scraps of cloth, symbols born of West African memory, blended with fragments of Christian prayer. They were not writing rebellion. They were weaving a binding dot, and the land responded. First, the dogs stopped barking. Then the birds abandoned the cane. Even the wind seemed to falter, as though the plantation itself was holding its breath. To the white overseers, it was silence. To the 12, it was assent. Josiah Brant, blinded by his own cruelty, mistook this silence for fear. He thought his dominion had deepened, that his grip was absolute. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. The silence was not submission. It was the pause before a ritual. One evening, as dusk bled red across the horizon, Brant walked into the quarters alone. Some say he followed a sound only he could hear. Others claim Elijah himself lured him there. But what happened after was not chance, not rage, not rebellion. It was deliberate, ritualistic, and final. He did not die that night. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he was taken. The night Josiah Brant vanished, the moon was swollen and red, a wound carved into the sky. Old women whispered such moons were thresholds, a time when the dead pressed close and the living were wise to stay inside. But Brant was not wise, and he did not stay inside. He entered the slave quarters with his whip in hand and arrogance in his step. He thought himself master of shadows. Instead, he was swallowed by them. The 12 did not rush him. They moved like a circle closing. He struck once, copper singing through the air, but his arm was seized and wrenched until bone cracked. He was not killed. That was the first rule. Death would free him. They wanted something heavier. He was bound with cords soaked in ox blood, gagged with strips of his own shirt, and dragged to the hollow they had carved beneath the floor. 6 feet deep, squared by hand-hewn boards lined with ash and moss. At each corner, a talisman waited. Small objects crafted in secrecy, carved stones, knotted twine, scraps of cloth painted with symbols older than America itself. Each talisman bore the blood of one man, a vow signed not in ink, but in flesh. They did not speak as they lowered him down. Words were no longer necessary. The soil itself was listening. Brant's screams began high, sharp, defiant. But as the earth closed over him, his voice changed. The sound deepened, dragging downward, as though the soil was not muffling him, but pulling his very voice into its depths. Each of the 12 spat once into the cavity before covering it with their hands. Not shovels, not tools, hands. For hours, they passed dirt into the hollow, until his movements stilled, until his breath turned ragged, until nothing remained but silence and a trembling in the ground. When the final handful of earth was placed, they did not weep. They sat in a circle around the fresh mound, heads bowed, eyes open, listening. And in that listening, something else stirred. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence, a containment, a seal. At dawn, they rose and returned to their work as if nothing had happened. But nothing would ever be the same. For they had not buried a man. They had locked away a hunger. And the earth, having tasted his scream, remembered. The burial did not end with silence. Silence was only the surface. Beneath it, the ground pulsed faintly, as if the soil itself had swallowed a heartbeat that would not stop. The 12 felt it each night in their bones, a pressure building under the quarters, a reminder that the man they had buried was not gone. He was changing. At first, they believed they had succeeded. Days passed, and no overseer came searching. No dogs sniffed the ground. Brant had been a man of violence, not of family. His absence was dismissed as drunken wandering, perhaps a fall into the river. The planters shrugged and carried on. The cane was cut, the cotton weighed, life resumed. But the quarters did not forget. One by one, the 12 began to weaken, not from lash or hunger, but from something no whip could deliver. Elijah, who had led them, woke drenched in sweat each morning, claiming he had heard Brant breathing beneath the floorboards. The boy, barely 15, spoke of scratching sounds when no one else was near. The cook's hands shook so violently she spilled boiling water, blistering her flesh. Each bore the mark differently, but all bore it. Their pact had not been without cost. In binding Brant, they had tied themselves to him, knotted their spirits with his restless hunger. The ritual did not erase his cruelty. It absorbed it, and now it lived inside the circle. The first to fall was the boy. Found at dawn, stiff, eyes wide, a trickle of soil at the corner of his mouth as though he had swallowed earth in his sleep. No burial, no ceremony. They burned his body at the edge of the field, hoping fire could sever the tether. But the ground only pulsed harder, and that night the others heard Brant's whip strike once in the dark. Next came the cook. She vanished while gathering water, her bucket discovered overturned near the well. When they searched, they found no footprints lay, aiding away. Only the faintest depression in the soil, shaped like a body dragged downward. The remaining 10 no longer whispered of victory. They did not speak at all. They moved through days hollow-eyed, marked by a growing terror. They had bound a man to the earth, but in doing so, they had sown themselves into the same soil. And soil, once fed, always hungers for more. Curses do not remain where they are planted. They spread, seeping outward like oil through water, staining everything they touch. What began beneath the floorboards of the quarters soon reached into the heart of Westcott Plantation itself. At first, it was subtle. Lantern flames sputtering though no wind stirred, tools vanishing and reappearing in impossible places, whispers threading through the cane at night. But the longer Josiah Brant lay in the earth, the stronger the reach of his hunger became. The White family in the big house did not notice immediately. Wealth blinds the senses. But their servants did. They swore the walls moaned after dark, as though the house itself shifted in its sleep. Doors opened by unseen hands, and in the silence after midnight, the faint crack of a whip echoed down the halls. The mistress, unable to rest, complained of a copper taste on her tongue. She dismissed it as illness. It was not illness. It was memory. The fields, once orderly rows of green, grew restless. Cane split at the stalk, bleeding sap that smelled faintly of iron. Livestock balked at the pastures, refusing to graze. Horses screamed and reared when forced toward the quarters. The dogs, once fierce protectors, cowered and gnawed their own paws until they bled. And then came the sickness, not the familiar fevers of swamp air, but something heavier, stranger. Men woke with dirt under their fingernails, though they had not touched the soil. Women bled from the gums, as if copper wire had been threaded through their flesh. Children woke crying, clawing at their ears, insisting someone was breathing beneath their beds. The 12 dwindled further. Each loss fed the ground, thickening its appetite. Elijah, now gaunt and hollow-eyed, understood the truth too late. They had not buried Brant to silence him. They had buried him to root him, to plant his cruelty like a seed, and seeds do not stay seeds. They grow. The planters began to speak in hushed tones about selling the land, moving west, escaping whatever unseen rot had taken hold. But it was too late. The plantation had already been claimed, absorbed into a hunger that no deed, no sale, no river crossing could escape. Because what lay beneath was no longer a man. It was a wound, and wounds spread. The land turned, not gradually, not gently, but with the sudden violence of a snare snapping shut. By midsummer, Westcott Plantation was no longer a place of harvest. It was a place of rot. Cane that should have stretched tall and green collapsed in blackened stalks, brittle as bone. The cotton bolls burst before ripening, spilling fibers matted with red clay, as if the earth itself had begun to weave its own shrouds. At night, the air thickened until it pressed against the lungs. Breathing felt like swallowing soil. The families in the big house tried to pray, but their prayers broke into coughs, choked by the taste of dust. They heard the sound of dragging chains where no chains were laid, saw figures flicker in doorways, only to vanish when approached. Shadows no longer obeyed the sun. They stretched where they pleased, long fingers creeping across the floors. And then the taking began. The field hands spoke of people simply sinking. A woman carrying a basket of cane stumbled and fell. By the time others reached her, only her hands remained above the soil, twitching before the ground closed over them. A child chasing a chicken vanished mid-step, the earth swallowing him without a sound. Not even a mound remained to mark the spot. It was as though the land had grown mouths. The White family fared no better. The master himself was found one morning sprawled on the veranda, eyes open, throat packed with dirt. The mistress fled screaming into the fields and was never seen again, only her torn bonnet, half buried in clay. Servants whispered the soil had claimed her before she could reach the river. By then, only Elijah and 2 others of the 12 remained. Their bodies were withered, but their eyes burned with the knowledge of what they had unleashed. They had not destroyed Brant, they had anchored him. His cruelty had become root, and root had become hunger, feeding on every soul that touched the cursed earth. And yet Elijah did not run. He stood at the heart of the quarters, palms pressed to the floorboards above Brant's grave, whispering, "We are bound. If I flee, it follows." The other two begged him to stop, but his gaze was fixed downward, listening to the faint, steady rhythm pulsing through the ground. It was not a heartbeat. It was a whip striking, again and again, beneath the soil. By autumn, Westcott Plantation was a carcass. The fields stood barren, the big house sagged under mildew and silence, and the air itself reeked of copper and clay. Where once laughter, hymns, and screams had mingled, now only the ceaseless hush of soil remained. The land no longer pretended to be fertile. It pulsed openly, a wound unhealed. Of the 12, only Elijah and one other endured. Ruth, a woman whose voice had carried songs that once disguised messages of hope. Now her voice was gone, shredded by nights of choking on dirt she had never swallowed. Her eyes were wide, rimmed red, but she remained beside Elijah, unwilling to leave the one man who still stood against the hunger beneath. Together, they watched as the plantation emptied itself. White families fled into the bayous, muttering curses and prayers, never to return. Enslaved men and women scattered when they could, carrying whispers of the ground that ate the living. But still, Elijah stayed, not from stubbornness, but from duty. He alone understood that their ritual had never been one of freedom. It had been a tether, and the knot still held. Ruth begged him to leave, her cracked voice breaking into sobs. But Elijah only pressed his palm to the earth and said, "If I leave, he follows. If I stay, he feeds." His words were not resignation, they were recognition. He knew that what lay beneath the floorboards was no longer Josiah Brant, no longer man, no longer overseer. It was hunger given form, bound to his name, but unchained from his flesh. That night, under a moon drowned in fog, the quarters shook. Boards splintered, soil split open as though exhaling centuries of breath. Ruth screamed, clutching Elijah's arm, but his face was calm, almost serene. He whispered words older than the land, older than chains, words no one else could hear. Then he looked at Ruth for the last time and said, "Run." She did. She fled barefoot into the swamp, carrying only her voice, broken and raw, a living witness to what the earth devoured that night. Behind her, the quarters collapsed inward, swallowed whole, the sound muffled as though the soil had closed its mouth around a secret too large to speak. When Ruth looked back from the tree line, there was nothing left. No house, no mound, only flat, trembling ground, as if nothing had ever stood there at all. And yet, even in silence, she knew it still waited. Time moved on, but the ground did not heal. The Civil War burned through Louisiana. Plantations rose and fell. Railroads carved through swamps. Towns grew from dust. Yet the stretch of land that was once Westcott Plantation remained empty. Surveyors avoided it. Farmers swore their plows broke in its soil. Even hunters refused to tread there, claiming their dogs whined and their rifles jammed when aimed across its borders. No deed ever held it for long. Families who tried to settle the land abandoned it within months, muttering about nightmares that bled into daylight. They spoke of soil that shifted underfoot, of shadows that stretched against the sun, of whispers rising from the ground at night. Some claimed they heard the crack of a whip across the fields. Others swore they saw a figure standing in the distance, tall and rigid, his hand clutching something that glinted like copper in the moonlight. By the 20th century, the land was left to rot. Locals called it Hollow Acre. Children dared each other to step onto its edge, to press their ear to the soil. The bravest would return pale, shaken, swearing they had heard breathing below. Some never returned at all. Their families built shrines at the tree line, leaving offerings of bread, tobacco, coins, anything to appease what lingered. The older generation did not laugh at such tales. They simply nodded, as though remembering. Even now, the earth still shifts there. On certain nights, when the moon burns red, the cane fields whisper though no wind stirs. Travelers on the nearby road swear they hear chains dragging behind them, though no one is there. And sometimes, when the night is very still, a single whip crack splits the silence, sharp enough to rattle glass. But the worst is not the sound. It is the silence that follows. That heavy, suffocating stillness, as if the land itself is holding its breath, waiting. And those who have felt it know the truth, that Hollow Acre is no field, no ruin, no forgotten plantation. It is a grave, not of one man, but of a hunger that cannot die. And if you ever find yourself walking there, remember this: do not stop, do not listen, and above all, do not look down. Because the ground remembers, and once it has your name, it never lets go.